In the last heat of the day, when the air thickens and the wind holds its breath, the sound began. Long, low, and frayed at the edges. A roar, not of strength or warning, but something else entirely. It came again, then again, circling wide through the open land like a sound untethered from a body. Rangers on patrol paused near a cluster of camelthorn trees, their boots quiet on dry earth, listening. There was no movement on the horizon, only dust and dying grass. But the sound would not stop. By the time they reached the ridge, dusk had begun its quiet descent. Beneath the open sky, they saw him. The lion lay still, half shaded by sun-bleached shrub, ribs stretched tightly beneath his skin, every breath shallow and earned. His mane was faded and patchy, no longer thick with the pride of age, and yet his head tilted just enough to face the wind, his mouth opening again to send out that broken sound, low and drawn, like something remembering its voice. The men did not approach quickly. They stood for a long time at a distance, watching. Even from far off they could see that the lion had not moved in hours. Flies clung to his haunches, his tail barely flicked, but his eyes were open, tracking slowly, blinking once as dust swirled. When the wind shifted, he turned his head a few inches and the roar came again. Fainter now, but persistent. The call of something lost. They moved in slowly, circling wide so as not to alarm him. He did not rise. One man crouched and whispered, "You're not done yet, boy." The others watched his breathing. No blood, no visible wounds. Just bones under skin, hunger written into every part of him. A rib cage that no longer rose fully. A tongue dry and cracked. The earth beneath him held old paw prints, some smaller, some deeper. Tracks of others who had likely passed through days earlier. Perhaps his pride, perhaps not. The plains gave no explanations, only sound and heat and wind. One ranger set down a water container a few meters away, not too close. Another radioed back to the station. No drama, no panic, just quiet voices and practiced hands. The lion watched with one eye but did not flinch. He did not have the strength to. Above, the sky turned from pale to violet. The horizon flickered with the orange sheen of retreating light. Still, the lion made no move. He only lifted his head once more and roared, a sound now hoarse, barely rising, but still there. A sound that had not abandoned him, even if the rest had. As the stars began to surface, the rangers stepped back. Their silhouettes blended into the low trees. The lion lay as he had, motionless, framed by dust and dark. But his call had quieted. Whether in fatigue or in peace, no one could say. The plain listened, now silent, and so did they. They returned before the sun crested the thorn trees, carrying only what was needed: water, gauze, a light tarp, and their patience. The lion had not moved far in the night, just a shallow shift in the soil where he had tried to curl himself tighter against the cold. His roar had faded to a low rasp, no longer reaching outward but instead remaining close to the throat. As they approached, his ears flicked. His eyes, dull but watchful, followed them without panic. He did not rise. He did not run. There was no urgency in the men's steps, no sudden motions. They paused often, giving him time. One crouched, setting down a folded cloth soaked in water, dragging it gently across the ground to lessen the scent of humans. The lion blinked slowly. His mouth opened, then closed again. It was unclear if he smelled the water or merely tasted dust. The tremble in his flank was barely visible, but constant. Flies gathered near his tail where the fur was thinned to nothing, and his spine rose like a ridge beneath the golden folds. When he tried to lift his head, it wavered halfway up before falling again. The man nearest him whispered, "Just stay with us." It wasn't instruction, just presence. Words filling the air gently. They worked in silence, placing the shallow dish near his paws, laying a strip of cloth soaked in sugar water over the edge so it might draw moisture to his cracked tongue. He made no attempt to lap, but his nostrils moved and his eyes didn't close. That was enough for the moment. A second ranger took photographs, quietly, methodically, not for show, for documentation, for records, for the vet who would later ask how the lion looked on the first day. Every bone could be seen beneath the fur, hip joints like knobs, legs that seemed to bend too sharply at the knees. His paws were caked in soil, and the tips of his claws barely protruded, dulled by exhaustion, not sheathed in warning. He flinched once when one of the men accidentally stepped too close to his side. Just a shallow jerk of the shoulder, a ripple of thin muscle beneath the ribs. It faded almost instantly, replaced by the deeper stillness of surrender. But it was not fear. It was the body's quiet agreement with gravity. The decision was made to stay. No relocation yet. The risk of moving him now was too great. His heartbeat barely registered. His breathing shallow and uneven. They would build a perimeter nearby, monitor quietly, let time and shade hold him until strength could return. There would be no injections, no tranquilizers, no attempt to carry him. Not today. As the morning wore on, a breeze lifted through the acacia branches, stirring fine red dust into slow spirals. The lion blinked more often now, reacting to the movement of light and scent. Once he turned his head slightly toward the sound of water being poured behind him. The motion cost him effort. His jaw trembled when he rested again. But it was motion, nonetheless. The men kept their distance as the heat climbed. They watched for signs, anything that might suggest pain or distress beyond hunger. But the lion did not groan or resist. He simply existed, barely tethered, his body thin as a shadow pressed into the earth. And still his eyes remained open, not alert, not defiant, but present. They watched the world pass, watched the humans move slowly around him, watched even as his own breath shallowed again. When the sun reached its highest point, a single breath lifted the dry grass beside his chest. It waved once, then fell still. Morning after morning the rangers came, carrying water and small measures of food softened to ease a failing stomach. The lion no longer roared, but his breaths came steadier now, each exhale less shallow than before. His body remained sunken and frail, the skin clinging to bone. But the faintest change could be seen, his tongue moving against the wet cloth, his nostrils flaring when the scent of life brushed the air. For days, he lay where he had fallen, a shape pressed into the dust, unable to rise. Yet with each sunrise he offered something more. A blink quicker than before, a head lifted briefly, a glance that lingered longer on the quiet figures beside him. The men never rushed him. Their movements were as measured as the wind through dry branches. They spoke little, only when needed, words that were low and steady. "Easy now," one said when the lion shifted to reach for the shallow dish, the great paw sliding clumsily across the ground. It was not strength, not yet, but the first stirring of will. His eyes, though dulled by hunger, caught the light of dawn as if holding on to something fragile. By the fourth day, the tremors that once shook his flanks had eased. He still sank quickly into stillness, but his head began to rest higher, propped by the earth rather than surrendered fully to it. His mane brushed the ground, brittle and thin. But when a breeze moved through the acacia branches, he lifted his nose, scenting what lay beyond the camp. That simple act carried weight, an instinct searching past the pain of his body. When food was offered, he tried to chew, jaw weak and uncertain, fragments falling from his mouth. The rangers did not force more upon him. They only waited, offering smaller portions, trusting his body to decide its pace. His ribs still stood sharp as spears beneath his skin, but the hollow look in his eyes began to soften into something slower, steadier. Then, one morning, With the sky pale and the first birds stitching calls into the silence, he shifted differently. His forelegs pressed against the ground, unsteady and shaking, but no longer content to lie still. The muscles along his shoulders tightened, the effort trembling through every line of his frame. He lifted himself a few inches, chest heaving with the strain, then collapsed again into the dust. The attempt left him gasping, his sides rising unevenly, but it was a new sound, a breath forced by effort, not only by survival. The men nearby did not move to touch him, nor did they speak loudly. One only whispered, "That's it. You try." Then they stepped back, giving him the space he sought. His head turned toward the grass beyond the clearing, where the land stretched in quiet gold. Though he lay still again, his paws flexed faintly, claws extending and retracting as though remembering their place. As the sun climbed, the lion rested, body too weak for more that day. Yet the dust still held the mark of his attempt. 2 shallow prints pressed by his forepaws, a sign he had fought gravity, if only for a breath. The ground around him was no longer the bed of a dying animal, but the beginning of something stirring, fragile, and alive. The breeze shifted once more, carrying the scent of trees far in the distance. The lion's eyes followed it, his chest rising with a rough inhale, and then he lay quietly again, the grass bending softly at his side. The 7th morning came with a pale hush across the land, the kind of silence that follows long waiting. The lion lay where the soil bore the marks of his struggle, the shallow impressions of paws pressed again and again in his attempts to rise. His breaths had steadied in recent days, his ribs still sharp but lifting with more rhythm. When the rangers arrived, he was already awake, his head lifted higher than before, mane stirred by the cool breath of dawn. There was a faint tension along his shoulders, the kind that came not from weakness but from gathering intent. They gave him water as they always had, setting it close and stepping back, their presence calm and familiar. He lowered his muzzle, tongue rasping over the surface with more strength than they had yet seen. When he finished, he did not sink back into the dust as he had in the days before. Instead, he braced his paws beneath him, the muscles in his legs quivering as they took on weight long abandoned. For a moment, nothing happened, just trembling effort. Then, with a slow and uneven push, he lifted his body from the earth. The rise was unsteady, a fragile victory carved against exhaustion. His legs shook violently and his haunches wavered as though the earth pulled him back. But he held, chest forward, head lifted higher, as if reclaiming something of himself. The rangers stood in silence, not moving closer, not speaking until one whispered softly, "Easy, boy." The lion's ears turned faintly at the sound, but his eyes were fixed elsewhere. He turned his head toward the horizon, where the acacia trees scattered in quiet patterns against the gold of the plains. His nostrils widened, drawing in the wind as though it carried memories stronger than his failing body. The air was rich with scents. Dust, distant grass, the faint trace of other animals carried far. He stood like that, wavering but firm, the pull of something beyond the human presence stirring within his still thin frame. The moment did not last long. His legs faltered, knees bending until his body lowered again, chest pressing back into the soil. The fall was not defeat, but inevitability, the cost of effort spent too soon. Yet even as he sank down, there was no finality in the motion. He settled with his head turned outward, nose still lifted toward the trees. The men exchanged no hurried plans. They had seen enough in that fragile stand to understand. The lion was no longer only surviving. He was reaching beyond the place of thirst and hunger, thinking of the land that had once been his. They would not hold him longer than he wished. Their work now was only to give him the strength to follow that scent when his body was ready. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the rattle of dry seed pods in the branches above. The lion's ears twitched. Eyes half closed but awake, his chest rising with the steady rhythm of recovery. He no longer looked at the men beside him. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the trees stood waiting. The morning grew warmer, light spilling across the plain. Dust lifted in soft spirals around his mane. The rangers stepped back, their shadows lengthening over the ground. Behind them, the lion lay still, thin body pressed into the earth, but with his nose toward the wind. The trees swayed faintly in the distance as though answering his silent regard. The land was still when the day of release arrived. The sky, pale with early light, stretched wide over the plains, and the air carried the scent of dust and far-off rain. The lion had walked within the safe enclosure for days now, strength returning in slow, uneven measures. His ribs still showed, his mane still thin, but his step no longer faltered each time he moved. The rangers had done all they could. Water given, food measured, the quiet presence of men who asked for nothing but his survival. And now, as the gate opened, they stepped back. The lion paused at the threshold, head low, shoulders tense. His ears flicked toward the open field, where tall grass bent with the rhythm of the wind. He did not look back. With a heavy exhale, he stepped forward, paws pressing softly into the earth, his body sliding into the wild as though it had always belonged there. The grass closed behind him, golden stalks erasing his trail. Within moments, he was gone from sight. The men remained, their figures still against the fence line. They did not call out, nor follow. They knew this was the moment when care must end, when the weight of choice returned to the animal. One of them whispered almost to himself, "Go on now." It was the last sound they offered. For hours the plains held silence. Heat rose, insects thrummed, and the scent of wildebeest drifted across the air. Somewhere in that expanse the lion moved unseen. His pace was not hurried but steady, guided by sense older than memory. He wove through brush and dry channels, pausing often, resting when his body asked, moving when the breeze shifted. Each step returned him closer to the pattern he had once known, the trail of his own kind. The faint threads of belonging stretched thin across the land. As the sun lowered, the grass stirred with a different kind of movement. Shapes emerged far across the plain, half hidden in the trembling heat. At first they seemed only shadows, blending with the color of the earth. Then, slowly, the outlines grew clearer, figures moving together, shoulders brushing, tails swaying in unison. It was a pride, scattered in the tall grass, their presence cautious yet unmistakable. The lion had found them. He slowed as he drew near, his head lifting higher now, nostrils wide to take in the scent carried on the wind. The shapes paused, some turning their faces toward him, their ears pricked in recognition or doubt. The air between them held weight, stretched thin with silence and memory. The lion stopped just short of the final gap of grass, his chest rising and falling, his tail flicking once. From among the shapes, a female stepped forward. Her body was strong, her coat full, her gait steady. She moved without fear, pausing only once to glance back at the others. Then she came closer, her eyes fixed on him, her steps measured. When she reached the open space between them, she slowed, lowering her head just slightly, her whiskers trembling in the air that separated them. The lion did not retreat. He held himself there, thin but steady, meeting her gaze without sound. For a long moment they stood like that, two figures pressed against the edge of distance, silent yet bound by something deeper than words. Then, with a quiet step, she closed the space. Their bodies brushed, mane against flank, and she remained beside him. The grass swayed gently around them, the rest of the pride shifting in slow recognition. One by one the shapes began to settle, their outlines lowering into the cover of earth, their acceptance unspoken but present. The lion, once hollow with hunger and shadowed by despair, had returned not as a ghost but as part of a circle. He lifted his head then, chest swelling as breath rose through him. The sound came deep, low, and carried across the plain, a roar, full and resonant, though edged with the roughness of recovery. It rolled outward, touching the grass, the trees, the distant horizon. The female remained by his side, her body still, her ears forward. The others did not move. They listened. And then he grew quiet. The roar faded into the distance, and silence followed, softer than before. The wind moved gently through the stalks, bending them in slow waves. The sun slipped lower, staining the sky in gold and red. The lion lowered his head, his body folding calmly into the cover of grass. The pride settled near, shapes blending with his until they were one. From where the rangers stood, far back at the edge of the plain, nothing more could be seen. The wild had closed its circle. Their part was over. The air carried no sound but the rustle of wind through grass. The rhythm of a life returned to where it belonged. The land stretched on, vast and endless, holding the quiet shape of reunion, and in that stillness the circle was whole again. The night spread slowly across the plain, pressing the light down into embers of gold before swallowing it in deep blue. Crickets began their endless chorus, and far off, the low cough of another lion rolled faintly against the air. The newly returned male lay among the grass, his breath heavier now, his body spent from both effort and distance. Yet he was not alone. The female had remained at his side, her flank close enough that the warmth of her body eased into his. A quiet shield against the cooling wind. The pride shifted around them with the subtle restlessness of animals settling into the long hours of dark. Young lions, near grown but not yet at their full strength, paced at the edges before lowering into crouched positions, their tails flicking as they adjusted. Two cubs, barely steady on their oversized paws, pressed close to a lioness, their soft mews hidden beneath the heavier sounds of the adults. The scent of belonging thickened in the air, a mix of fur, earth, and shared memory. For the weakened lion, it was a balm stronger than food. Through the hours of night, he rested but did not fully sleep. His head lifted at intervals, ears catching every shift of movement around him. Though exhausted, his instincts had not dulled. Once, when a hyena's distant whoop echoed faintly, he exhaled a low growl, soft but present. The female by his side flicked her tail against his flank, not in comfort, but in a simple, practical recognition. She had heard it too, and she would not move. When dawn returned, the pride rose together. Shoulders brushed, tails arched, and their bodies slid through the tall grass with the quiet unity of those long accustomed to each other's rhythm. The weakened male followed behind, slower, but his steps were steadier than the day before. His mane caught the early sun, still thin but glowing at the edges, as though the light itself lent him shape. The female paused often to let him close the gap. Her presence unhurried, her movements sure. They reached a shallow rise where acacia trees spread their branches in crooked shadows. Here, the lions settled again, their bodies folding into the dappled light. The cubs pounced clumsily at each other's tails, watched by the steady eyes of their mothers. The young males stretched out, jaws wide in heavy yawns, before collapsing into the dirt. The returned lion lowered himself slowly, every joint deliberate, his ribs lifting and falling with the effort. Yet when the cubs tumbled too close, he did not shift away. His gaze followed them, and one paused, nose twitching as it regarded him before scampering back to its mother's side. The rangers who had released him remained at a distance now, watching from where the land curved into low cover. Their work had ended the day before, but still they lingered to be certain. Through binoculars they observed the pride's movements, noting the way the female shadowed him, how the others gave him space without exclusion. "He has his place," one murmured quietly, lowering the lens. It was not dominance, not yet, but it was belonging. And for a lion on the edge of death, belonging was survival. As the sun climbed, the pride stirred. Two lionesses moved off toward the distant herds, bodies low, muscles taut beneath their coats. The young males followed a short distance before peeling away, leaving the hunters to their work. The weakened lion did not rise. He remained in the shade, his sides heaving in the heat, conserving what little his body could manage. The female beside him did not leave either. She rested near, eyes half closed, ears turning with every shift in the breeze. The bond was quiet, without display, but steady. By late afternoon, the hunters returned. The scent of fresh kill carried on the air before their bodies appeared, shoulders bloodied, jaws stained. Behind them dragged the remains of a wildebeest calf, its weight pulled through the grass until the pride gathered to feed. The cubs hurried forward, their high-pitched mews sharp in the air, before being nudged back by their mothers. The young males shouldered each other, growls rising in low bursts as they jostled for position. The returned lion did not rush to the carcass. His head lifted, nostrils widening at the scent, but he remained low in the grass, his breath uneven. Hunger burned through him, but his strength was not yet ready for the chaos of the feed. It was the female who shifted first. Rising, she moved toward the carcass, pushing through the others with a swat of her paw that carried authority. She tore into the flank and fed briefly, then backed away, leaving space open. Her eyes turned once to where he lay. The meaning was not lost. Slowly, with deliberate effort, he rose. His legs trembled, but the scent of blood drew him forward, each step small but determined. When he reached the carcass, the younger lions gave way with reluctance, growling low in protest before yielding. He lowered his head and fed, his jaws tearing with a clumsy hunger, flesh filling the emptiness that had nearly ended him. He did not gorge, did not fight. He ate enough, then stepped back, chest heaving, blood staining the fur around his mouth. The female returned to the carcass after him, resuming her place as though the exchange had always been understood. That night, the pride settled heavier, bellies round with food, bodies draped against each other in loose patterns of fur and warmth. The weakened lion lay close to the female again, but this time his head rested higher, chin lifted over his forepaws, eyes steady on the horizon. His breath came deep and even, sleep pulling at him in longer stretches. Above, the stars wheeled in silence, the night deep and vast. Days passed in this rhythm. Each morning he grew steadier. Each evening his rest lasted longer. He did not hunt, not yet, but he fed, he walked, he endured. The cubs grew bolder, darting closer to swat at his tail before retreating in bursts of nervous energy. The young males gave him space, but not without watchfulness, their eyes always measuring. The lionesses moved with the calm certainty of creatures who accepted what nature decided. He was not at his peak, but he was alive, and he was theirs. One evening, as the sky burned red behind the acacias, he rose without hesitation and walked with the pride toward the hunting grounds. His pace lagged, but his shoulders carried more weight now, his body remembering what it once knew. The wind carried scents of zebra, wildebeest, and dust, and he followed, no longer as an outsider but as part of the moving circle. The rangers had left by then. Their work belonged to memory, their figures returning to their outpost far from the pride's range. But the echo of their patience lingered in the lion's continued survival. They would speak of him quietly in the months that followed, not with pride, but with the sober understanding that intervention had only given him a chance. The rest belonged to the wild. In time, his mane would thicken again. His ribs would fill, his roar would grow stronger. Perhaps he would sire new cubs. Perhaps he would fall to younger males in seasons to come. The wild owed him no guarantees. But in that stretch of weeks, on those plains where the grass bowed and rose with every shift of the wind, the circle had held. And on one quiet evening, when the pride settled after feeding, the lion rose to his feet, chest wide, breath strong. His roar broke across the plain once more, deep, resonant, unbroken this time. It rolled out toward the trees, carrying with it all that had been lost and found again. The cubs stilled, the females raised their heads, and the young males answered in rougher, shorter calls. When silence returned, it was not emptiness. It was balance. The grass bent softly, carrying the scent of blood and earth. The pride lowered into the shadows of the plain, their bodies merging with the night. The lion stood a moment longer, mane stirring, before he too sank down among them. The stars brightened overhead, silent witnesses to the endless rhythm of survival and return. And in the quiet, with the pride gathered close, the circle was whole.